Have you ever wondered, can music actually kill? Not in the literal sense of a melody pulling a trigger, of course, but in the way rivalries, egos, and the culture around music can spiral into violence. September 7th, 1996. Las Vegas. The city glows with neon, alive with the chaos of a Mike Tyson boxing match. In the middle of that energy, a black BMW glides down the strip. Inside, 25-year-old Tupac Shakur, one of the most electrifying voices of his generation, rides in the passenger seat next to Suge Knight, the powerful head of Death Row Records. Then, out of nowhere, gunfire. Tupac is struck multiple times. 6 days later, he dies in a hospital bed. Fast forward just 6 months. March 9th, 1997. This time, it's Los Angeles. The Notorious B.I.G. Christopher Wallace, only 24 years old, leaves a crowded industry party. He climbs into an SUV with his friends, laughing, enjoying the night. But only a few blocks later, a Chevy Impala pulls up beside them. Shots tear through the car. Biggie dies almost instantly. 2 young men, 2 of the greatest rappers of all time, killed in eerily similar ways, only half a year apart. And almost 3 decades later, their murders remain officially unsolved. These weren't just random acts of violence. Tupac and Biggie's deaths became the dark symbols of a larger conflict, what we now call the East Coast-West Coast rap war. A rivalry fueled by record labels, street gangs, and media hype. For fans who lived through the 1990s, these killings weren't just tragedies, they were turning points. Moments that changed hip-hop forever. So today, we're opening a new cold case file. We'll dig into the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G., tracing every lead, every theory, every dead end. We'll look at what investigators from the LAPD, the NYPD, and even the FBI uncovered. We'll bring in reporting from the Los Angeles Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, CNN, and updates as recent as 2025. And let me be clear, where facts end and speculation begins, I'll make sure you know. Some theories, like those pointing fingers at record executives such as Suge Knight, are based on speculation rather than verified evidence. But before we dive into suspects and theories, let's step back. To really understand these cases, we need to know the men at the center of them. Not just as victims, but as artists, as sons, as cultural icons. So let's rewind. Let's meet Tupac and Biggie and the world of hip-hop that shaped them, and that they, in turn, helped shape. To understand these unsolved murders, we can't just look at crime scenes or suspects. We have to know who Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G., really were. Because to millions of people, they weren't just rappers. They were voices, storytellers, even prophets of their generation. Let's start with Tupac. Tupac Amaru Shakur was born in New York City in 1971, named after a revolutionary from Peru. From the beginning, his life was tied to struggle and activism. His mother, Afeni Shakur, had been a member of the Black Panther Party, and Tupac grew up hearing about social justice, inequality, and the fight for dignity. That sense of urgency, of wanting to speak for the voiceless, never left him. By the time he was in his 20s, Tupac had become more than a rapper. He was also a poet, a trained actor, and an activist who carried the weight of his community on his shoulders. His songs like Keep Ya Head Up and Changes spoke directly to people living with poverty, police brutality, and systemic racism. And yet, he was also a young man with flaws, sometimes quick-tempered, often caught up in the chaos around him. His 1996 double album, All Eyes on Me, became the soundtrack of the West Coast. It wasn't just music. It was a declaration that Tupac had arrived as one of hip-hop's biggest stars. Now let's cross the country to Brooklyn, New York. Christopher Wallace, born in 1972, grew up in the tough neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant. His mother, Valletta Wallace, worked as a preschool teacher and tried to keep him grounded. But Biggie, as friends called him, was drawn into the streets at a young age. He hustled, he made mistakes, and he ended up serving time. But he also had a gift, a deep, booming voice and a storyteller's instinct. When Sean Puff Daddy Combs signed him to Bad Boy Records, that gift exploded onto the national stage. Biggie's 1994 debut album, Ready to Die, turned his life story into poetry. Tracks like Juicy and Big Papa weren't just hits. They were reflections of a young man transforming pain into art. Where Tupac's voice was fiery, almost revolutionary, Biggie's was smooth, charismatic, and witty. Together, they represented 2 sides of hip-hop's evolution. But by the mid-1990s, The music wasn't just about beats and rhymes anymore. It was about territory. The industry began framing things as East Coast versus West Coast. On one side, Death Row Records in Los Angeles, led by Suge Knight, with Tupac as its crown jewel. On the other, Bad Boy Records in New York, led by Puff Daddy, with Biggie as its rising star. The media played into it, painting every lyric and every comment as part of a war. Diss tracks like Tupac's infamous hit, Up poured gasoline on the fire. Gangs, Bloods, and Crips were tied to the labels. And suddenly, what might have once been competition on the charts was spilling into the streets. For fans, it was heartbreaking. Imagine being a teenager in 1996, blasting Tupac in your headphones one day, then switching to Biggie the next. They were the voices of your youth. And then within 6 months, both were gone. Not to old age, not to illness, but to gunfire. This is why their murders struck so deeply. They weren't just individual losses. They symbolized the cost of a culture being torn apart. And in a way, they forced hip-hop to reckon with itself. After Biggie's death, there was a push toward reconciliation. Artists began calling for peace, for unity, for an end to the East-West rivalry. But the pain never fully healed. So when we ask, who were Tupac and Biggie? The answer isn't just two famous rappers. They were young men with extraordinary talent, complicated lives, and dreams that ended far too soon. And that's what makes the unsolved nature of their cases so haunting. But now that we've seen the world they lived in and the battles that defined their era, it's time to step back into those final nights. What exactly happened on the Strip in Las Vegas, and later on the streets of Los Angeles? Let's walk through the timelines of their murders, moment by moment. So now that we know who Tupac and Biggie were, let's step into those final nights, the moments when everything changed. It begins in Las Vegas, September 7th, 1996. The city is buzzing with electricity. Mike Tyson has just knocked out Bruce Seldon in the very first round of their heavyweight fight. For celebrities, athletes, and rappers, Vegas that night is the ultimate stage. Tupac is there with Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records. The two men leave the MGM Grand, surrounded by friends and bodyguards. But right outside the casino, there's trouble. Tupac and his entourage spot a man named Orlando Anderson. He's a member of the Southside Crips gang. Just weeks earlier, Anderson had allegedly tried to rob one of Death Row's associates. On sight, Tupac jumps into the confrontation. He throws the first punch. Security cameras catch the scuffle as the group beats Anderson before hotel security breaks it up. Hours later, Tupac climbs into Suge Knight's black BMW. They drive down the Vegas Strip, the city glowing with neon, music blasting from car stereos all around them. But as they stop at a red light near Flamingo Road, a white Cadillac pulls up alongside. Windows roll down. Gunfire erupts. 4 bullets hit Tupac. Suge Knight is grazed in the head, but somehow keeps control of the car. Tupac is rushed to University Medical Center. For 6 days, doctors fight to keep him alive. Fans gather outside the hospital. Rumors swirl. He's recovering, he's getting better. But on September 13th, 1996, at just 25 years old, Tupac Shakur is pronounced dead. Now you might ask, how could this happen on one of the busiest nights in Las Vegas, with so many people around, and still nobody identified the shooters? That's the mystery. Witnesses were reluctant to talk. The Cadillac disappeared into the night. And although police questioned Orlando Anderson soon after, no charges were filed. He himself would be killed 2 years later in a separate shooting. Fast forward 6 months. March 9th, 1997. Los Angeles. The Notorious B.I.G. is in town for the Soul Train Music Awards. Despite the tension between East and West, he insists he feels safe. That night, he attends an after-party hosted by Vibe magazine and Quest Records at the Peterson Automotive Museum. The place is packed, celebrities, industry insiders, fans. Around 12:30 in the morning, the party ends. Biggie leaves with his entourage in a caravan of SUVs. He rides in the front passenger seat of a dark GMC Suburban. Puffy Combs is in another vehicle close behind. At a red light on Wilshire Boulevard, a dark Chevy Impala pulls up beside Biggie's car. The driver's window slides down. A single gunman fires multiple shots into the passenger side. 4 bullets strike Christopher Wallace. His friends race him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but doctors can't save him. At only 24 years old, Biggie is gone. 2 rap icons, murdered in drive-by shootings, less than a year apart. The similarities are chilling. Both attacks happened late at night. Both involved cars pulling up beside their vehicles. Both suspects fled without a trace. And both cases hit at the height of the East Coast, West Coast feud. But here's what makes it even more unsettling. Despite the high profiles of these victims, despite the resources of police departments in two major cities, no one was convicted. Investigators collected shell casings, witness statements, and theories, but crucial evidence was missing. There was no DNA, no clear surveillance video. Just whispers, rumors, and conflicting accounts. For Tupac's case, police focused on that fight with Orlando Anderson earlier in the night. Many believe the shooting was retaliation, a gang hit carried out within hours of the casino brawl. The white Cadillac was linked to Crips associates, but nothing concrete stuck. In Biggie's case, investigators struggled from the start. Witnesses reported seeing a Chevy Impala, but the description of the shooter varied. Some said he was black, others said possibly Latino. Leads pointed in different directions, gang connections, label rivalries, even suggestions of police involvement. But again, no charges. And here's something worth thinking about. These were not ordinary men. Their lives were followed by millions, their movements tracked by press, by fans, by rivals. And yet, when it came to the moments of their deaths, silence fell. No one came forward with definitive proof. No one took the stand. It leaves us with haunting questions. Was Tupac killed because of that fight with Orlando Anderson? Or was it bigger, something tied to record labels and money? Was Biggie killed in retaliation for Tupac? Or was his death part of a different plan altogether? What we know for certain is that two of the greatest voices in music were silenced in less than a year. And every unanswered question, every missing piece of evidence, makes these cases feel less like history and more like wounds that never healed. So what did investigators actually do? Who were the suspects? And how, decades later, did one of those suspects end up back in the news, nearly 30 years after Tupac's death? Let's dive into the investigations, the theories, and the suspects who still cast shadows over these unsolved murders. Now let's talk about the work that followed, the investigations, the leads, and the people who ended up at the center of suspicion. This part of the story is messy by design. Different police jurisdictions, competing theories, key witnesses who went silent, and years, decades, of headlines that sometimes confused more than they clarified. The investigations into both murders involved the LAPD, the NYPD, and at times the FBI, but critics have long argued the probes were hampered early on by missed opportunities and by witnesses who refused to cooperate. Investigative reporting over the years has shown how quickly momentum can stall when crucial leads aren't followed up. Let's start with Tupac's case in Las Vegas. From the earliest hours, detectives focused on the scuffle outside the MGM Grand, the fight involving Tupac and a young man named Orlando Anderson, who was tied to the Southside Compton Crips. Anderson was questioned in the weeks after the shooting and was long considered a primary suspect by many reporters and some investigators. He always denied shooting Tupac and was never criminally charged in the case. 2 years later, Orlando Anderson himself was killed in a separate gang-related shooting in Compton, which removed a key person of interest from the investigative chessboard. That development complicated an already brittle case. For more than 2 decades, the Las Vegas homicide file had very few new leads, until a major break in 2023. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, who is Orlando Anderson's uncle and a longtime figure in the same circles, was arrested in late September 2023 and later charged in connection with Tupac's murder. Davis had previously written and spoken publicly about being in the vehicle from which shots were fired, and his own statements and memoirs became central to the renewed investigation. He has repeatedly denied pulling the trigger. Prosecutors have accused him of participating in and facilitating the shooting. As of early 2025, Davis remained in the Clark County Detention Center and faced additional charges while the murder case moved through pretrial stages. Those developments represent the first direct criminal case tied to the 1996 shooting in nearly 30 years, and they underline how long and slow cold case work can be. Now turn to the Notorious B.I.G. case. The Los Angeles investigation into Christopher Wallace's death has always been tangled with allegations, lawsuits, and competing explanations. Over the years, a number of theories have emerged. That the killing was a gang hit tied to the East-West feud, that it was ordered by rival label figures, and in more incendiary allegations that corrupt officers or associates of Death Row Records were involved. Some investigators, most prominently former detectives who later went public with books and interviews, have pointed fingers at named individuals. Wardell Pucci Faust, in particular, has been identified in those accounts as an alleged triggerman tied to death row associates. But it's important to stress, those claims have never produced a criminal conviction in the Biggie case. The family's wrongful death litigation and later reinvestigations exposed alleged lapses and raised new questions, but the criminal file itself remains officially unresolved. So why did both investigations struggle so badly? There are a few recurring themes. First, witness fear. In neighborhoods where gangs are real and retaliation is possible, people are understandably reluctant to testify. Second, the media environment. Sensational headlines, rapidly spreading rumors, and competing documentaries sometimes muddied the facts and created incentives for people to talk to journalists instead of detectives, sometimes telling different versions to different outlets. Third, procedural gaps. In the case of Tupac, critics have pointed to limited follow-up after the MGM scuffle. In the Biggie case, questions about internal LAPD failures and allegations of withheld files clouded efforts to find consistent leads. Add to that the simple passage of time. Memories fade, witnesses move, physical evidence degrades, and you have a recipe for dead ends. What about the more sensational theories? The ones people trade on message boards and late-night shows. You'll hear them all. That record executives ordered hits, that rival artists paid gangs, that law enforcement was complicit. Some of these theories grew out of real investigative leads and sworn statements. Others grew out of rumor and hyperbole. The cautious way forward, one I'll keep to throughout this series, is to separate what prosecutors have charged or what courts have found from what remains unproven. Where a claim is speculative, I'll say so. Where a defendant has been charged, I'll say that too. Right now, Keefe D's indictment is the most concrete criminal development tied to the Tupac case. By contrast, the Biggie homicide, despite decades of probing and a family civil suit, has not produced a criminal arrest that led to a conviction. Pause with me for a moment. Knowing all this, what feels most striking to you? Is it that fame and visibility did not insulate these men from violence? That alleged witnesses and suspects were themselves sometimes killed before cases could be closed? Or is it the idea that modern policing, with all its resources, can still be outpaced by fear and time? Share your thoughts. Your perspective matters, because these are not just law enforcement files. They are stories about communities, about media, and about the human cost when disputes turn deadly. Next, in our final section, we'll step back and ask what these investigations, what these failures and partial breakthroughs, mean for justice, for the legacy of Tupac and Biggie, and for the culture that both created and mourned them. We'll also summarize where the strongest leads stand today, and what would need to happen to finally put these two cases to rest. As we come to the end of this case file, let's take a step back. It's been nearly 3 decades since Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G, were gunned down on opposite sides of the country. Both were only in their 20s. Both left behind families, unfinished dreams, and a body of work that changed music forever. We've walked through the East-West tensions of the 1990s, the neon flash of Las Vegas where Tupac was shot, and the Los Angeles streets where Biggie was ambushed. We've traced the investigations, the missed opportunities, the suspects who rose and fell, and finally the most recent break. The 2023 arrest of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, a name that pulled Tupac's murder back into headlines after years of silence. And yet, even with that development, so many questions linger. The murder of Biggie Smalls, in particular, remains officially unsolved. Decades of theories, lawsuits, and documentaries have swirled, but no one has stood trial, and no jury has been asked to decide. That silence is its own kind of verdict, a reminder of how violence, secrecy, and fear can outlast even the loudest voices. But if there is a glimmer of meaning, it lies in the legacy these two men created. Tupac's words about struggle, injustice, and survival still resonate in classrooms, protests, and playlists today. Biggie's storytelling, his cadence, and his portraits of Brooklyn life continue to influence artists across genres. The feud that once divided coasts has long since given way to collaboration, to new generations of rappers building bridges where their predecessors had walls. In that sense, the tragedy forced the culture to grow. Now let me turn to you, the listener. Do you think these murders were purely the result of rap wars and rivalries, or do you believe something deeper was at play? Gang politics, industry power struggles, or even conspiracy? And do you believe we will ever see complete closure in either case? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your theories in the comments, and let's open the discussion. What is certain is this: time may pass, but the music of Tupac and Biggie does not fade. Their voices are still alive, in car stereos, in headphones, in the memories of fans who can still remember exactly where they were the day they heard the news. That is the power of art. That is the power of legacy. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Cold Case Files, the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into the mysteries that continue to shape our world. And as we close, remember this: Tupac and Biggie may be gone, but their music, just like their impact, will always remain.